I think the values is the key thing. So, I mean, if it's in the 1920s, there are, well, actually, there's a few kind of trends. So one thing is just that the basic understanding of the greenhouse effect and warming from carbon dioxide, 1896 was the first quantitative estimate, and it was surprisingly good, actually. At the time, people didn't appreciate just how much carbon we were going to emit into the atmosphere. But I actually think that with like further work, that should have been predictable because it's just based on an exponentially growing economy. What we started doing is like, imagine if we got started with the kind of campaign to be concerned about climate change, 60 years earlier or 50 years earlier than we'd done. You could have engaged in like very gentle long-term planning that like people wouldn't have opposed. Perhaps it's a carbon tax that's like 1 penny per ton to begin with, and then it just gradually scales up over time. You could have normalized these ideas, and it could have been like pretty painless. I think we could have just like essentially avoided the problem of climate change. We would have been acting on more speculative evidence, but I think the gains from acting early would have outweighed the losses from having to act on more speculative evidence. And so I actually kind of see a lot of the issues I'm pointing to, such as around engineered pathogens and artificial intelligence, as kind of like that, climate change in the 1920s or something. So that's one thing. Then secondly is priorities that I still think are important, which are ensuring good values, thinking about future technological developments, thinking about how bad the risk of war could be. Now, it's true that as things went, like obviously there was already enormous attention on, trying to stop the rise of fascist Germany. And so in that case, it's not so clear. Maybe there would have been extra effort on that or something, but it already was a lot. But still, I think that would have been helpful. Still, I also think that like more people thinking about that at the time, potentially even having a longer run thought on the potential for atomic weapons to just radically change society. Again, just more people kind of working on these issues and taking them seriously, it seems would have resulted in a better outcome, I think.
Yeah, like the example of climate change is an interesting one. Now, like bringing us back to today, what do you think we can actually do now to positively impact the long-term future?
Yeah, I think there's many things to do. The things that are most tractable and I'm most excited about, yet most neglected, are within the area of pandemic preparedness, where, this was actually one of the things that really made me endorse the kind of long-termist approach, like really on a gut level, is just seeing that people who are bought into these ideas were worrying about, global pandemics for many, many years, encouraging people to go into these areas and funding them since about 2016. There was a kind of community prediction that there would be a pandemic with at least 10 million dead. This was in 2016, in the following decade, but like 1 in 3 probability on this. And then it's just, well, it happened and was enormously costly and, this enormous tragedy. And it just made me think like, look, we just could have been preparing way more for, allegedly unprecedented events, but that are actually like foreseeable. And I think we can do this again. And now here's the second part of it. After COVID, what response has there been? Well, after 9/11, there was, $1 trillion of foreign interference. There was, a new Department of Homeland Security in the US, and just enormous kind of global response. And after COVID-19, it's been essentially crickets. But there are things that we can really do. So early detection. So you just all around the world have sites that are monitoring wastewater, screening that wastewater for all sorts of, all DNA in the sample, apart from human DNA. Is there any new pathogen that's like exponentially increasing? Then we can respond to pandemic like as soon as it arises. And then a second technology I'm particularly excited about is low wavelength light that you can install in light bulbs, and it kind of sterilizes a room, essentially. So in just the same way that, when I drink tap water, that has been chlorinated to cure it to stop it from giving me diseases. But yet the air I breathe is entirely like unpurified. Whereas with research and development, we could both ensure efficacy, safety, and also get the cost down. We could try to have this sort of lighting installed in light bulbs all around the world as part of building codes. We could prevent the next pandemic while also getting rid of most of the respiratory diseases. And that's just something that's like, look, it's on the table for us. We actually have a really pretty good understanding of like how viruses work and what we could be doing to protect against them.
It's so much on the table. And I think that's one of the things that made me quite a bit more pessimistic really in the last years. Like I think I would have expected that at some point we might have a pandemic. I think like the public health experts, the epidemiologists, they were very clear that the risk is considerable. So that wasn't that surprising. But the fact that we lived through an entire pandemic, 23 million people, I think, dead, that's kind of the current excess mortality estimate. Like obviously everyone spent all of these months indoors, all the lockdowns that we suffered through. And that we are now slowly getting to the other side of that. And we're doing almost nothing to prevent the next pandemic. That I would have really not predicted 2 years ago.
Yeah, me neither. I would have expected a much larger response from the governments of the world. And so in the United States, there was a bill called the Apollo program, part of Build Back Better, was funding the Apollo program to $70 billion, would have made enormous difference to the chance of the next pandemic. And just got completely struck down because there was no one really championing it in Congress. I know less about the UK, but it's also that I'm not, there's nothing I'm kind of aware of yet in terms of like really major programs. Because also globally, I mean, just economics, again, pure self-interest, like you mentioned to begin with. Even just from the perspective of, people in Europe and people in the United States, even if they don't care about even their children, they just care about themselves. They don't care about people, the global poor who will be most affected by a pandemic. Even just on those grounds, it makes enormous sense to be investing what is globally tiny amounts of money. And it's still not happening. And so I think we just, really need to campaign for that.
Yeah, we need to campaign for it. But I mean, these days, the effective altruism community increased so much in size, so many smart young people that are part of that community that you helped to start. Funding has increased a lot. And I think the effective altruism community was good in pointing towards the risks of future pandemics way before the pandemic. But what would you think were the big successes of the effective altruism community during the pandemic?
So during the pandemic, I do think it's like there's definitely a lesson for humility there, where I think, the EA community did much better at forecasting what was going to happen rather than compared to like actions that really made a big difference. So there was a significant amount of advice to governments about kind of locking down earlier rather than later as a result of, actually understanding how bad this was going to get. And I think plausibly that led to, many thousands or maybe tens of thousands of lives saved. There was some other things. I mean, you had this like... In my view, you had one of the best COVID responses, completely pivoting your entire organization in order to provide the world's best data so that governments could make more informed decisions. There was also a project that was just giving individuals advice called microcovid.org that did very well, just so people can know like what's the size of the risks from the different daily activities. There was a project that got set up called One Day Sooner that was trying to get a kind of human challenge trial set up where 60,000 people volunteered and said, look, I'm like young and like relatively healthy. COVID will pose a small risk to me. I volunteer to have a 50-50 chance of being infected. So I will get a vaccine, 50-50 chance of being infected. That would have enabled us, if those had been able to go ahead, that would have enabled us to have rolled out the vaccine kind of months in advance. And that would have been hundreds of thousands of lives saved. However, the main thing I think is just, man, I really wish we'd done more. Like, I wish we'd done so much more earlier, so that perhaps if we'd been pushing for human challenge trials like years before, we actually could have had the regulation in place such that you could quickly do that in an emergency situation, rather than what ultimately happened was that it took so long to convince policymakers that by the time the first randomized controlled, the first human challenge trial occurred, we already, I think, had approved the kind of vaccines. And it had been, safety had been demonstrated by observational studies. So.
And I mean, yes, I agree with you. I think there were more opportunities to actually be helpful during the pandemic, and it's a lesson in humility. And it connects to a bit of a larger point. I think the effective altruism 10 years ago, when you and others initiated this movement, was very much at home in the global health, global development space. And there you have the big opportunity or the big advantage that you can learn very quickly. You can trial interventions from vaccines to medical treatments to cash transfers, and you can see what works and what doesn't, and then you can focus on those things that work and scale them up. Now, if we hope to impact the far future, these trials will be very long, and it's much harder to actually learn what works and what doesn't. And then, given that one of the key concerns for the future is the pandemic, and maybe the effective altruism community didn't do as well as we would have wished. How worried are you about this lack of feedback, and maybe this quite poor feedback from this closest case to an actual big future risk that we now just suffered through?
So I think a couple of things. So I think one is that as soon as you start to accept the kind of just the model, in my view, moral fact that like future people really matter, and it's like this huge future ahead of us, then we have like failure of like true feedback from anything we do. So it can be like helping people in the short term, and like, okay, we can be sure we're helping people in the short term, but how does that impact the very long term? It would be kind of negligent to just like ignore that altogether. But then we've got to say, like, actually, for most of the impact we're having, because I think most of the impact of anything we do in the short term, or most things we do in the short term, are over the long term. It means we're having to just, make our best guesses or say we don't know. A second, though, is just, again, this kind of distinction of like thinking long term and acting near term, where there are things we can do that do have feedback loops. So again, we have a pretty good understanding of, the mechanisms of viral transmission. So we can build a early monitoring wastewater system. We can see, like, does that work? Is that effective at doing this kind of more narrow target, this like shorter term target of just, is it picking up pathogens? Is it detecting new pathogens? Similarly, we can like see whether low wavelength lighting is working, because the number of people having colds would reduce like an awful lot. So you can have like feedback in the short term. And then like, what's the link between that and the long term? Well, there you do have to rely more on arguments and considerations. The kind of easiest case, I think, of something in the short term having very long-term impacts is human extinction, where, or other species extinction too, but focusing on human beings, like, it just is the case that like, if human beings go extinct, we're never coming back from that. And so we just know that that's something that would have like this extremely long-term impact. It would impact like however long humanity's life expectancy would otherwise be. But then the final thing I'll say as well is just the main criticism that effective altruism, when focused on kind of global health and development, had was, look, you're just focused on what you can measure. And, there's this story that actually comes from a 15th century Turkish satirist called Nila the Dean, I think, which is about, okay, there's this drunk and they're looking for their keys, and they're looking for the keys kind of under the light of a street lamp. And someone comes up and says, look, why are you are your keys like under the lamp post? Why are you looking there? And they say, oh no, that's not where my keys are, but that's where the light is. And people would, use that analogy and argue against. They say, look, you should not be focusing on the things that are easy to measure. The most important things are going to be much harder to measure. You just got to make your best judgments. And so you can see this as a kind of response to that, where we're saying, look, yeah, we're trying to focus on the very most important things. Sometimes it's just really hard to know if you're making any progress. In the case of like reducing the risk of a third world war, nuclear war, I think it is just very hard to know if you're making progress. Does that mean we shouldn't try? I think probably not. But it is certainly like, if there's one kind of spectrum within effective altruism, it's probably on this dimension. There are some people who are like, look, if we don't have good feedback loops, I'm really pessimistic that we can make any progress. And those people, still focus on global, the sorts of bed nets, deworming, things that are like making measurable impacts in the short term. And that's still scaling enormously, like closing in on $1 billion per year. And then there's the people who say, look, I'm willing to accept, maybe I'm not going to have as reliable feedback loops, but then I'm focusing on what I think is really the most important thing. So.
Right. There are these two extremes. Where do you fall yourself in this on this question? What is the right mix for the EA community more broadly, or for anyone who wants to do good? Should they put all of their effort into global development, or all of the effort into long-termism?
So, I think any individual person you'll need to make a bet, unfortunately, because someone who's working half time on malaria and half time on nuclear war or something is probably not going to be as effective as, if you've got two people, one specializes in each. I'm really in favor of an effective altruism community that has a diversity of different worldviews and a diversity of different areas that it's focusing on. And that's for a few reasons. But one of which is just that I expect us to learn a lot more, again, over the next kind of coming decades. And I think a community that has a diverse array of focuses is just going to be one that's much more adaptable over time. But then for me personally, I'm more in the focus on what's most important direction. Although I definitely feel the worry about I feel the worry about the lack of feedback effects and so on. And within, that does mean that I think, for example, pandemic preparedness, where I think we can be really very confident we're making progress on this, at least often, compared to some other issues, like reducing risk of nuclear war. It does make me a lot more excited about it. It makes me see that as the kind of lowest hanging fruit within long-termist work.
Right. And how do you think about this going forward? Is there some moment, is there some signal, some heuristic that you're looking out for where you would think, okay, we're actually on the wrong track with focusing on long-termism? Is there actually we actually don't succeed in really reducing the risks? We're not really succeeding in improving the values that future generations might inherit from us. Is there some moment that you would wait for where you would say, I would want to achieve this by that point in time, and if we don't succeed, then I really have to revise my thinking on long-termism?
Sure, yeah. So I think there's two ways I could revise my thinking. One is certainly just more kind of philosophical or theoretical arguments, just about value of the future versus near term, and some of the arguments I give in the book and what we are the future could certainly I could certainly be convinced out of that. And then a second, I think, one area that's of particular interest is the field of AI alignment. So the risk is that we might build increasingly powerful AI systems, but just not have a very good understanding of like what they're going to do. And especially as AI systems get more and more powerful, start to act more like actors in the world rather than just tools, it becomes increasingly important for us to be able to actually predict how they will act in the world. This is an area where, in one important sense, you do get feedback systems. So the field of AI alignment is thinking, okay, how can we build AI models that are helpful, harmless, and honest? And so I can have like a language model, something that like produces text, can engage in like basic conversation. And I can say, okay, I want to train this such that it never lies. So it never tells me something false. Well, something that false that I can have evidence like knows the answer to. And so we can do that. That's something where we can actually like get like positive feedback on. If it was the case that in kind of 10 years time, and this field is like really in its infancy, and it's still up for debate, I think, kind of how much progress on the object level has been made. Like there's been a lot of like clarifying, like understanding of the issues. But in terms of like, oh yeah, this paper has made this like really important advance on the alignment problem. I don't think we're quite there yet. And so if it was 10 years time, and that's still true, that would be a pretty, yeah, I think like that would be a pretty harsh blow to that as a field, at least. And so then you would need to, pandemics and just kind of, there's just so many things we can do to reduce the risk that I guess, I don't know, it could again be like we do all these things and they just keep failing and they keep failing. Or maybe we just keep learning that there's like surprising kind of backfiring effects or something. For pandemics, I think that's kind of less likely. But it could be the case that if in all of the cause areas that we think are kind of most important by long-termist lights, we just keep finding like 10 years time, we've made almost no progress on it, then yeah, I'd really want to rethink. Yeah, then at that point, I'd be like really rethinking things. Again, it might still be all like philosophically justified by how things ultimately get like benefit the long-term future. But the set of priorities would be like very different and might look a lot closer to commonsensically kind of building a flourishing society.